Now, since this horror began, this particular horror, since last October, at the genocidal onslaught that Israel has unleashed against the Palestinian people, there's, for me, one of the most important people who I always look to, always listen to, who just knows the details inside out, is Muhammad Shehada, my brilliant guest today. He's a Palestinian writer and analyst. He's from Gaza. I should say, like so many Palestinians from Gaza, he has suffered an immense personal cost at the hands of Israel's murderous onslaught, one of the great crimes of our age. Throughout, I just cannot emphasize just how important a resource, if it's not dehumanizing to refer to a person as a resource, Muhammad has been. And what we're going to do today is, because we're so lucky to have such an incredible mind and resource, is to rebut some of the big lies, myths, talking points, propaganda points that the Israeli state and their cheerleaders have fed Western public opinion in an attempt to justify one of the great crimes of our age. So, Mohammed, thank you. It's such an honor to have you. How you doing?
Thanks so much for having me.
Look, let's just start. Let's just go through them. Bang, bang, bang. Let's go through these. So, firstly, Israel says, we left Gaza in 2005, and look how we were repaid with rockets and attacks. We ended the occupation. Look what happened.
There's much to unpack here. There's the question of, did they actually leave Gaza? Why did they do it? And how did they do it? And what happened after? And I think all of it collapses upon examination. The reason why they left Gaza at the time was nothing to do with peace. It was a unilateral disengagement. It was not coordinated with the Palestinian Authority. The disengagement back then was explicitly advocated for by the Deputy Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who said, if we don't do this now, this sort of gerrymandering and pushing Gaza out of the question, then he, quote, says, the Palestinians will begin to move from an Algerian model to a South African model. And that's a much cleaner, much more efficient struggle in terms of asking for one man, one vote and equality. And Sharon's political advisor, the top aide to Ariel Sharon, the Israeli prime minister, came out to say explicitly, he says, we're pulling out of Gaza, quote, to freeze the peace process. When you pull out of Gaza, you put the onus or the burden of proof on the Palestinians to show that they can turn Gaza into a Mediterranean Dubai on the Mediterranean, or Singapore in the Mediterranean, without any economic tools. That's the point that I'm getting to later, which Israel anticipates they will fail at repeatedly and show to the world that they are not deserving of a state in the West Bank. And also to take, as Dov Westglass said at the time, to take the refugee question completely and to save settlements in the West Bank. That's basically what he said on record. So at the time, they made a compromise with the Bush administration that if we leave Gaza, you have to make a statement that Palestinian refugees only have a right to return to the occupied territories and not to Israel, which the Bush administration did. And they disengaged a few settlements from Gaza, but then added way, way, way more settlers to the West Bank. So basically, that was the rationale behind pulling out, is to freeze the peace process, kill it, take it out of the equation, give the Palestinians a test that can never be performed or achieved, and then nag them about it all the time. The way they did it at the time was basically, as I said, uncoordinated. That was number one, which allowed Hamas to come out and say it was not negotiations that led to this. It was not the peace process, but it was armed resistance. Negotiations led nowhere. Armed resistance liberated Gaza. There were banners of that sort all over Gaza. The other thing that they did about it was basically when they left, or when they pulled the troops and sort of reconfigured the arrangement of occupying Gaza from the outside, because, as you know, the United Nations and every single human rights organization on the face of the planet says Gaza is still occupied. Even Israel's leading legal authority, Yoram Dinestein, says that Gaza is still occupied. But when they sort of reconfigured the arrangement of the troops, they basically did so with the intention of besieging and impoverishing Gaza as much as possible. So there is a Biden State Department envoy to the Middle East called David Satterfield, who said recently that when Israel was about to pull out, we told them, open up Gaza, let it live, let it be an example. And they did the exact opposite. They closed it down and besieged it. The way they did this was basically written in the actual law of disengagement. It said cutting Gaza's labor force from Israel and the West Bank until, quote, it ceases completely. So that at the time caused what Sarah Roy, a leading economist at the Harvard University, she said that this caused Gaza the worst economic depression in modern history, because overnight you have tens and tens of thousands of Palestinians who used to work in Israel or the West Bank cut from their jobs completely overnight, collapsing the economy. And that was coupled as well with a whole list of restrictions on the Gaza Strip, which is why when you look at the blockade of Gaza, it doesn't really start in 2007. It goes all the way back to 1993, and it intensifies and eases around milestones. So the New York Times in 1995, they interviewed Palestinians about the Oslo peace process and how good was it going for them. The most resonant word that was used by Palestinians in the article, 1995, was open air prison. The title of the article was Palestinians Learn Peace Has Its Limits. So basically, it starts from there. Israel starts building a wall around Gaza in 93. It intensifies. Gaza gets an airport in 98. Israel bombs it in 2001, then bombs it again 2002, and then closes Gaza with in the early 2000s up until that point of the disengagement, where it shut down completely.
It's quite interesting as well, isn't it, that it was about doubling down on the West Bank as the real prize. And obviously, there's this attempt, isn't there, by Israel to kind of treat Gaza and the West Bank as almost like these separate entities, but for the Palestinians, it's the Palestinian nation. So the idea was disengaged from Gaza in order to basically expand settlements in the West Bank and therefore make a Palestinian state impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. There was also another element to it. It made it easier for Israel to bomb Gaza intensively with these 2,000-pound bombs. I remember my first airstrike was basically when I was, I think, 4. It was a newspaper that was bombed in my neighborhood by an Israeli Apache helicopter. But it was not possible for them to use F-16s on this scale or F-35s with 2,000-pound bombs up until they disengaged from Gaza. Then 2006, the year after, they start bombing Jabalia. 2007 as well. 2008, Operation Cast Lead, and it goes on. And bombardment becomes much easier, which was something explicitly said at the time by, I think, Ehud Olmert, the deputy prime minister. He said it would make it easier for us to use more violence on the Gaza Strip.
So, talking point number 2. The Palestinian people, after Israel leaves Gaza, voted for Hamas. Hamas took over Gaza violently, and the same will happen to the West Bank if Israel leaves. This is the lesson from Gaza. We end our occupation and settlements. Look what happens.
Well, basically, I remember those elections very vividly. Hamas didn't run on anything to do with Israel or the occupation. They basically ran a campaign pointing out the failures of the peace process that made it incredibly easy for them, economic and governance failures. So they ran a campaign that was titled Change and Reform. And they pointed out to all the deficiencies in the economy, the skyrocketing unemployment from the disengagement, the failure of the Palestinian Authority to deliver basic services or to actually provide security to Palestinians, because the PA's mandate is to provide security to Israel, but not to defend them with anything vis-a-vis Israel. So it was incredibly easy for them at the time. That was one of the things that made it possible. I remember Ismail Haniyeh and the head of Hamas and Ahmad Bahar, who became deputy parliament speaker. They would go from one neighborhood to the other and say, Haniyeh would say, if I win the elections, I'm not going to have a giant mansion and a giant entourage and a beautiful, luxurious office like those PA officials have. My office is going to be the mosque. I'm going to be accessible to everyone. He reneged on these promises to some extent, to a huge extent, I would say. He had an entourage and a beautiful car and an office, etc. Power is very tempting. There was also Ahmad Bahar, who would go and say, look at my car. It's a Subaru, a model of 1974. If I ever change that car, know that I've been corrupted in my heart and I'm no longer fit for office. They would say, we are going to reduce the prices of every basic commodity significantly. A cooking gas cylinder is going to be, instead of $20, it's going to be $4. And they ran on these economic promises. The other thing that happened at the time was basically the Palestinian Authority, or Fatah, the dominant party in the PA, ran on 2 slates minimum. And they had a huge amount of candidates because they were divided internally. That's something that even Bill Clinton says on record was one of the reasons for Hamas's win. And the third point is that Hamas didn't actually win a majority of the vote. They won a plurality of the vote due to the way the Palestinian electoral system was structured. They had a majority in the parliament. But basically, they won, I think, something about 46% or even less than that. They didn't cross a majority. But ever since, Palestinians have promised to reform the electoral system so that if other elections are held, people would choose whatever they want. Many would choose differently. It would not lead to either Hamas or Fatah holding a majority. It would have proportional representation. So Palestinian parties would have to have an internal debate about what is their vision vis-a-vis Israel or the two-state, etc., and form something together. But ever since, every time there's a talk about an election round for Palestinians to choose, you hear a lot of talking points about the PA need for reform. They need to reform. They need to reform. The most basic reform is a democratic process. And every time Palestinians try to go there, it happens one of two things simultaneously. Israel would go and arrest candidates at will. It would arrest, kidnap, arbitrarily detain candidates, or call them to sabotage the elections and threaten to say, if you run, we're going to do this and that. The other thing is that the United States would give Mahmoud Abbas a hint: cancel the elections. We cannot handle the risk of Hamas winning, even if it's a very minor risk. Even with Palestinian reconciliation talks, whenever the Palestinians try to get together to undo Hamas being in charge solely of Gaza. I had a very knowledgeable friend who worked with the Americans for about 2 decades. He said every time there was a round of these talks, he would get a phone call from the Americans telling him, today you have to ruin it. Call Mahmoud Abbas, call whoever you can in the Palestinian Authority, bring it down, tank it. So that's basically the dynamic. And Europe in that picture is largely rhetorical. They say, we love elections, we want elections. But once you dig and talk to some of the officials in Brussels, they say, we cannot not say we want elections. But there's no will, there's no momentum to actively push for it. So it collapses every time.
Here's another talking point. Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. There's been so many opportunities for peace, for Palestinians to have their own state, and it's the Palestinians who've basically failed to take those opportunities.
No, there's so much to say here. The record is very tedious and technical, but I would say that the most harmful thing about this propaganda talking point is that it's a binary. It's either you say yes to the Trump deal or you're against peace completely. It's either you accept a bad deal or you're just a rejectionist. But if you look at the record, there are many instances where Israel as well rejects peace offers. One of the most prominent is the Arab Peace Initiative. It would normalize Israel completely in the Middle East and the Muslim world, including with Iran, because it's part of the Islamic Cooperation Organization that endorsed the Arab Peace Initiative. Since 2002, it was proposed by Saudi Arabia. So you have full normalization with the entire Muslim world in return for 22% of historic Palestine given to the Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza and some of East Jerusalem. And Israel, it does not only reject it out of hand and never talk about it, they actively sabotaged it. There was a similar version of the Arab Peace Initiative in 1981, I think. If I remember correctly, it was in Fas in Morocco. At the time, there's an Israeli right-wing security analyst, a prominent one called Avner Yaniv. He wrote a book called Dilemmas of Security, in which he argued that Israel faces a very credible risk at the moment. And that risk is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Lebanon, becoming too moderate that Israel would have to sit at the table and negotiate with them. And he recommends bombing the south of Lebanon and Lebanon disproportionately to push the PLO back to extremism again in order to sabotage what he called a peace offensive when Palestinians become too moderate and the world sort of rallies behind them to end this conflict. There's also the other instance in 1988 when the PLO declared recognition of the two-state solution, accepted a Palestinian state on 22% of historic Palestine. If you look at the record at the time, Israel had a panic attack, the entire system, left and right. So you had, what's his name? Yitzhak Rabin, who was a minister of defense at the time, I think. And he said, we have to kill this immediately. And this is an insane danger. I'm paraphrasing here, but that was the essence of what they were saying. The foreign ministry, they immediately formed a crisis group to sabotage it. to respond to it in a way that smears and delegitimizes whatever the PLO came up with. The Israeli prime minister at the time, I think Yitzhak Shamir, was also explicit about destroying that sort of initiative, that peace offering from the PLO. And you had the full system in panic attack. I'm happy to provide the sources for that. And at the time, there were some Jewish activists that went to meet with Yasser Arafat that tried to sort of build bridges and connections. And Israel immediately condemned them. Those were the sellouts. You're trying to normalize Arafat. But even if you look at a more modern record, so 2006, I think, was the last time, or 2006 to 2008 was the last time that Palestinians were about to have serious negotiations with the Israelis under Ehud Olmert. They came very close to an agreement. The distance was not very vast. The US did not sort of bridge them together. And these are the things that Israeli sources told me. But one thing about it that was very incredible is that one Israeli source, very high up in authority, happy to name him, but he was in the defense establishment, in the government, very close to the prime minister. He said as soon as Olmert was sworn into office, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, he called that guy, the senior official, repeatedly and implored him one time after the other to arrange a meeting with Olmert so that they can start the negotiations. And he quote said, Abbas was begging me over and over again to ask Olmert to meet with him and talk. And he said for 1.5 years, Olmert said, I don't want anything to do with that guy. He refused to sit and negotiate. That's what the senior official told me. Olmert was sort of avoiding it as much as possible, was not serious about it, until around the end of his mandate, when the corruption charges were sort of showing up, when he was about to be impeached, when it was slowly creeping to his mind that he would lose power. So around 2008, that's when the start of the negotiation, or that's when the negotiations take a serious turn. They come very close, but then he's impeached. He's down from authority, and he's imprisoned.
Let's go to this next talking point. Most Palestinians support the horrors of the 7th of October and therefore have collective guilt, I suppose, is the talking point.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's also lots to unpack here. If you look at the people that conducted this poll, Dr. Khalil Shikaki, a very good friend, he explicitly says, no, Palestinians are not supporting the atrocities that happened on October 7th. 80% of Palestinians, what they say they explicitly support, 80% of the Palestinians that support October 7th are the ones that say that it put the Palestinian cause back on the agenda at a time where Palestinians were facing an existential threat or just basic slow death. The only obligation Palestinians had, especially in Gaza, was to languish and die silently. So the majority, 80% of those who support it, say that it's because it put us back on the agenda. It reminded the world of our cause. And he says something more. He says that the vast majority of Palestinians do not believe that Hamas committed these atrocities. They believe that either some of these atrocities have been exaggerated or made up by Israel, and we've seen many that were debunked, or they believe that the atrocities were committed in the second wave of the attack. The second wave, that's when you had every single militant group in Gaza, along with a number of hooligans and riffraff going inside and having a lot of free time to do whatever they could. So basically, the support there is not stemming from support for the violence itself. I've had a lot of intensive talks with Palestinians from different walks of life, different backgrounds, that I can say nearly confidently that they are representative of the population and how they feel about October 7th. There is a huge deal of criticism to it, particularly in Gaza, even within Hamas itself. If you look at the Wall Street Journal, for instance, leaked messages of Yahya Sinwar, Hamas's leader. I'm not trying to defend him, but the Wall Street Journal says that Sinwar said, this went too far. It wasn't supposed to go that way, probably in reference to the second wave, or perhaps some aspects of the first wave as well. But if you talk to people in Gaza, you would have a lot of criticism, nuanced criticism of October 7th on multiple grounds. There are people who would say that it allowed Israel to destroy and wipe Gaza completely. So it was a very very wrong decision to make, a misadventure, miscalculation. There are others who would say that they did not calculate how Israel would react well, or they did not coordinate well with other Arab countries or Arab forces or other fronts to come to Gaza's aid. They did not do this. He did not prepare logistically for the population in Gaza. There's a lot of resentment. And there are moral objections to the atrocities that occurred. When you dig into these atrocities individually and you point them out, you get a lot of moral condemnation of the specific actions that happened. But at the same time, there's the point that the same Gazans make, the same Palestinians make, and others as well, especially the ones that are supportive of October 7th, who would say that look at October 6th, the day before, and how what Gaza looked like. Not even October 6th. I was recently reminded of an article I wrote in 2020, 4 years ago, about the rising suicides in Gaza. Gaza is a very culturally conservative and spiritual and sort of religious society, which is a basic coping mechanism when you are facing extermination or slow death. You resort back to something that brings you comfort. But even then, there's the belief, the basic Islamic belief, that suicide is a gateway to eternity in hell. But even then, there were about 60 suicide attempts per month. Around the time that I wrote that article, there were 7 suicides within a couple of days. Successful people taking their own lives, unfortunately. And every single case of these were young women and men in their 20s, early 30s, because the equation that you had there is basically every single person I know, or virtually every single person I know with a lucky minority, had no future, no life, no past, no present, no history. They had a long list of academic achievements. They had very impressive CVs, except for the work experience because of Israel's siege and Gaza that destroyed the economy. So virtually every single person I know was futureless. And a lot of them would say that, I'm afraid I'm going to die before I ever experience living. Every day was incredibly painful to just exist. When you wake up, get out of bed, eat breakfast with your family that you didn't contribute to, you do so while bowing your head down in shame. When you go out for a walk in front of your neighbors, you do so with your head down in shame. You have nothing going on with life. So they had no ability to start a life, to start a family, to fall in love, to put food on the table. And basically, they had plenty of time to agonize and contemplate their slow demise. So the worst day of the year for many of my friends in Gaza was basically their birthdays. I would be very cautious about saying happy birthday to any of them. It was very painful because it's a reminder your life is wasting before your eyes and you can't do anything about it. And that was Gaza's situation. People's only obligation was to languish and die silently. So on October 6th, it became even more extreme in many ways. Israel was setting a record, literally a record, a historic record in the West Bank with the highest numbers of Palestinians killed since records began in 2005. The year before set the record as well. They were setting a record in brutality against Palestinian detainees in the Aqsa Mosque. The issues that are very inherent to Palestinian identity, that basically Palestinians consider it a compass of their own situation vis-a-vis slow death. If Israel can manage to escalate in Al-Aqsa or against detainees or raid the West Bank freely, that means we're basically out of everybody's minds, out of everybody's agenda, completely abandoned to face our fate on our own. So that's the thing that I wanted to point out with attempted suicides, is you were at a situation where people believe suicide is a gateway to eternity in hell, yet hundreds and hundreds of young Gazans were attempting to take their own lives. The thought crossed the minds of nearly everyone I know, because they believe that God's hell, no matter how horrible and frightening it is way better than the hell that Gaza has been turned into. And I remember at the time that issue was covered in other media outlets as well. It got to the point that the US representative or ambassador to the UN raised it up in a meeting publicly and said young people in Gaza were taking their own lives. The conclusion was, it's Hamas's fault, let's move on. The world was looking this straight in the eye and not doing anything about it. So a lot of people would point out and say, October 6th was unlivable. So no matter what happened on October 7th, at least it shook up the status quo. At least it put the cause back on the agenda. And the third sentiment is one of Hamas's secrets for gaining strength has always been not the appeal of their ideology or agenda or actions, but rather the humiliation, the demonization of the Palestinian peace camp over many, many, many years. I cannot face a Palestinian straight in the eye and say that I'm a peacenik, that I oppose violence and believe in coexistence, because the response would be, name one good thing that came out of this. I genuinely cannot. I couldn't help a single person I know in Gaza, no matter how many connections you have here and there, no matter how much you've been committed for this peace and coexistence. I couldn't help a single person in Gaza to get them a tent or food. I couldn't stop Israel from bombing the homes of every single member of my family, and kill scores of my friends and loved ones and family members. So this humiliation of the Palestinian peace camp, also the Palestinian Authority as well, it's weakening, it's delegitimization, it's demonization, not just of proving that this path of action is entirely futile, but actively going after Palestinian voices of moderation and Palestinian voices of diplomacy, negotiations, or peace, or non-violence, and demonizing them as anti-Semites, as terrorists in suits, as PR terrorists, etc., etc. So that creates a huge support for Hamas as desperate and despaired last resort, because nothing else works.
Linked to that, another talking point, which takes on, I suppose, this is the kind of attack on this, what you've so eloquently put. If Gaza was such a nightmare and so terrible because of what Israel was doing with its siege and all the rest, what about these lavish hotels, these videos showing all the splendor of Gaza, if you like?
Yeah, I'd say if you look at the poorest countries in the world, you would find identical and even more lavish hotels. If you look at Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis on the face of the earth for many, many years, you had five-star hotels all around it, and very fancy restaurants and people with access to TikTok. The situation in Gaza was this. Many of these hotels were built around the Oslo Accords in anticipation of tourists that would come in but were never allowed by Israel. And many of them were built around 2011-12 when the regime in Egypt, the Mubarak regime, collapsed. And Gaza had a partial removing or easing of the blockade. There was a more sympathetic government in Egypt that opened up Gaza, not completely, but partially to the world, because Egypt's side of the blockade is bound by agreements with Israel. There is an agreement on movement that governs the way the Rafah border crossing works, in which Israel explicitly retains overriding authority and supervision and oversight over every person that goes in and out of Egypt's borders. That was the agreement to 2005. And also the American element of you need to satisfy American security concerns. So that obliges Egypt to contribute to the blockade in a way. But basically, when Gaza was partially open, there were some of these hotels and shopping malls built as well. There were a very, very small minority in Gaza that had an okay life going, although far from perfect on many grounds. I'll explain. So I had two friends, Ali, may God rest his soul, and Ibrahim. Ali was basically the most brilliant person I knew. He would magically summon whatever philosopher, historian, politician you could think of. He was very well acquainted with American politics, British politics, the EU, Ukraine, China, Russia, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro. You would bring any of it and discuss it for hours nonstop. And Ali had basically no life, no job opportunities, nothing going for him. He tried desperately to leave Gaza, and that was not working as well. The blockade basically in place. The world is increasingly hostile towards migrants and refugees from the global south. So that was an impossibility. He was killed by Israel in January. I still haven't moved on from his death. The reason is basically that I know this guy was desperate to live, but never got a chance. He never experienced a measure of life whatsoever. He never experienced living. So that's the average Gazan that I know, the overwhelming majority of Gazans. Brilliant, highly educated, overachieving, but no life, in a state of complete non-life or futurelessness. Then my other friend Ibrahim, that's from the very fringe minority. I would even count them on my fingers, who was a computer engineer, a programmer. So he managed to make a living beyond Gaza's confinements online. And that is basically like a lottery. It doesn't work for everyone, but he managed to make it work. Therefore, he made a decent amount of income that allowed him to enjoy these facilities that Ali would never be able to go to ever. But even for Ibrahim, he had a child that was born 3 years before the war. His child was having speech difficulties, very explicit signs of PTSDs and trauma. He was running to him all the time, wetting the bed, having all sorts of problems. Because even during quiet times in Gaza, there's always a reminder of the war going. There's this sound that never stops whenever I called anybody in Gaza. And that sound goes like this. Zzz, and it's sometimes louder than their own voices. And that sound has been a very integral feature of life in Gaza for the last 2 decades. It's Israeli predator drones that are equipped to shoot to kill anyone at free will at any point, and hovering over your head all the time. And Israel manipulates the altitude based on if they want to send a message, an intimidating message collectively to the Gazan population, they would lower the altitude of these drones and make the sound even more unbearable. So the trauma is always there. So I would say these hotels were there for tourists that never came. They were largely collecting dusts, but there was a very small minority in Gaza that managed to enjoy them because they transcended the siege on Gaza once they were able to make an income from outside. For instance, also international NGOs workers or workers in the United Nations. But that was a very fringe minority. And even those, Ibrahim, everything he had was lost in the war. Israeli soldiers didn't bomb his house or his apartment. They went inside, burned it to the ground, left nothing standing. It was pure ash. Now he's basically destitute and impoverished and homeless. He's living in Deir al-Balah in a tent. Not even a tent. He only has a plastic roof on top. He sent me a video and nothing more. And that's the only thing.
I mean, this kind of leads on from this, I think. This talking point. There was a ceasefire on the 6th of October, and it was broken, not by Israel, which had respected the ceasefire, but by Hamas and other armed groups.
Well, if you look at the Israeli record, I do the painful exercise of reading virtually every single Israeli newspaper daily, twice in the morning and evening. They never refer to October 6th as a ceasefire. They refer to it as the concept, repeatedly. The security concept, the security concept, the security concept, because it was not based on a written agreement of a ceasefire or even a verbal one. It was what is called understandings, mediated and brokered by Qatar and Egypt. And the understandings were calm and quiet in return for Hamas suppressing and maintaining. In return, Hamas maintains and suppresses any sort of actors that try to shake up the status quo. In return for Israel throwing a few crumbs of mercy on Gaza, few easing measures. So they allowed, I think, about 17 to 20,000 workers to go and work in Israel, which was huge for those people. But 20,000 out of a population that is 2.3 million, about more than 1 million of these are adults. The majority of them are unemployed. It's just a drop in the ocean. So there were these easing measures. Another easing measure was opening and shrinking up Gaza's fishing zone all the time. If you look at the record, it's absolutely ridiculous. So Israel would say you're allowed to fish within 3 nautical miles. If you go beyond that, we're going to bomb you or arrest you, destroy your boat. And they did that all the time. And then they would expand it to 5, then reduce it back to 2, then expand it to 6, then back to 3. And they toyed with it all the time like ping pong as a way of rule and containment and basically governing Gaza from the outside. Israel has the ultimate authority over everything that goes in and out of Gaza, but also the ultimate authority over who can live in Gaza, because Israel controls the population registry. So I have family that live, for instance, in the Emirates or around the world, what is named as diaspora Palestinians that were forced to flee after 48 or 67 and never allowed to return back. They cannot even come to visit me in Gaza when I was there, because Israel does not have them on the population registry. If they manage to sneak in somehow and pay a bribe or go through a tunnel, they cannot leave because Israel does not give them a Palestinian national ID number. But back to the point about no ceasefire on October 6th, there was this concept of calm in return for easing measures. But Israel was violating it all the time. and Israel was using it to escalate in the West Bank to set a record, as we discussed earlier, with the highest number of Palestinians killed ever, but also in Gaza. So the 2 weeks before October 7th, Gazans were being shot down at the border between Israel, or not even a border, because Israel does not have recognized borders, but the perimeter fence between Israel and Gaza. They would go there to protest the blockade in very few numbers. And Israel would take pot shots at them, one after the other, dozens wounded, a few killed. And that was the situation whenever people tried to go to that perimeter fence. The other dimension is that Hamas did actually offer Israel many ceasefire proposals, actual ceasefires over the years. If you look at the record, it goes back to the 90s. I don't say that Hamas are the good guys, far from that. But if you look at the record, it goes back to the 90s, where they would say a permanent ceasefire, what is known in Arabic as hudna, or truce. It's a sacred concept in Islam that you have a ceasefire where you are completely obliged by it, complete cessation of hostilities from both sides. There is an article in 2012 by Alof Ben in Haaretz, that's the chief editor of Haaretz, Israel's left-wing main newspaper. And the headline of the article was this: we killed our subcontractor in Gaza. And the subcontractor was Hamas's head of the militant brigades, Ahmad al-Jabari, because Jabari was advancing, as Alof Ben himself wrote, Jabari was in the process of advancing a permanent ceasefire with Israel that eases and lifts the blockade on Gaza in return for full cessation of hostilities. And Jabari founded what is known in Hamas as the field control, or the field adjustment. This is a unit that is tasked during ceasefire times, or during lack of hostilities. I wouldn't even term it ceasefire, but during lack of hostilities, they are tasked with shooting to kill anyone that tries to attack Israel, or arresting them and detaining them, even if they do as much as attacking Israel with a balloon, an incendiary balloon, as it was called at the time. They would be arrested immediately by Hamas. And that was the situation for at least the last decade, but more clearly in the last 5 years, to the extent that observers were saying on record that Israel has a more solid transactional relationship with Hamas than it does with the Palestinian Authority, because it does not have any political aspect to it. It's calm in return for easing the blockade. And Hamas holds a superior moral ground over other armed groups and militants in Gaza, so they could suppress them and contain them much easier than the PA could, because the PA is seen as corrupt or collaborationist with Israel. But the term that was never fulfilled was actually easing the blockade on Gaza. Beyond a few easing measures here and there, Israel was not taking any significant step to allow Gaza to live and fulfill even that understanding, even that concept. They were reneging on their promises of lifting or easing the blockade significantly, basically in Israeli society, or in the Israeli mainstream. And I say that from very deep knowledge. It's a political suicide. A political suicide. If you ever speak about Gaza in humane terms, even before October 7th, if you ever say we need to restore hope to Gaza, we need to restore progress, we need to do this and that, it's a political suicide. You're going to fail out of the political mainstream. And if you look at the record, 2021-22, the Israeli defense minister, that's when there was the alleged ceasefire, the Israeli defense minister at the time, Benny Gantz, was saying, quote, we will not allow any real development in Gaza, any real economic development. Very clear, very blunt about it on the record. No economic development, no life. He said, quote, we're not animals. We're going to give them food and water, but no real economic development in Gaza. So that was explicitly violating even the concept that existed there of holding a cessation of hostilities. Again, a ceasefire is still possible, a written ceasefire, the one that's being advanced at the moment, that Netanyahu is saying no repeatedly to, and only agreeing to a temporary pause for a few weeks and back to the war again after getting a few hostages out.
Here's two which are linked together. Hamas builds tunnels and rockets instead of... Well, actually, no, let's take this in isolation. Hamas builds tunnels and rockets instead of schools and hospitals. It could have built a different Gaza, but instead, investing in those things, it just built things to attack Israel.
Well, basically, there's also lots to unpack here. One point is that how do you reconcile that point with the earlier point that Gaza had a lot of lavish and luxurious hotels and resorts and spas and swimming pools if they're busy building tunnels and rockets? So basically, that one point sort of is very contradictory, irreconcilable fact. There's the other point. Gaza had plenty of schools and hospitals, plenty, before the war. Not enough for the population. A lot of schools functioned with 2 times a day. So some kids would go to school in the morning, some in the afternoon. Some functioned with 3 times a day. Because of lack of space, lack of construction material that was going into Gaza. Israel, if you look at the record since 2014, the last major war, Operation Protective Edge that I survived, they left about 20,000 homes destroyed in Gaza. Up until October 7th, the reconstruction process was never finished for these homes. It took a decade and they were nowhere near finished because Israel imposed what was called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which meant every single truck that goes into Gaza with any construction material, they had to be fitted with a GPS monitor, surveillance cameras that Israel can peek into and can surveil all the time. They had to be pre-approved by Israeli authorities in a process that could take months and months and years. And they had to make sure that this truck goes to its final recipient, and they had to ensure that nothing is diverted from it. And that process that takes forever killed any potential for reconstructing Gaza and slowed down the reconstruction process permanently. While at the same time, it didn't stop Hamas from building tunnels. They managed to build even more. But the question here that you have at hand is no matter how many universities, hospitals, schools, mosques, whatever basic economic infrastructure you build in Gaza, it does not have any viability as long as there is a suffocating siege on the enclave that kills and tanks down the economy. There's no such thing in Gaza as a stock exchange. There was no such thing as a financial system per se. There were a few banks that are monitored, controlled by Israel from the outside, and that's about it. There's no possibility for foreign investments. The backbone of the Israeli economy is foreign investments in the high-tech sector. So basically, there's no job opportunities. There's no ability to export. There's no ability for industrialization, no ability to import at will. You can't even have a McDonald's in Gaza, which is one of the reasons, funnily enough, one of the main things that developed the tunnel industry in 2007, 8, and 9 was basically to get food that we couldn't get in Gaza at the time. We were starved the same way that Gaza is starved right now. It was very extreme, no fuel, no water, no electricity, no food. Israel was very explicit about it. The Israeli prime minister said at the time, Gazans should learn how to walk. That was his basic statement, very blunt. You should learn how to walk. Dov Westglass said, we're putting Gaza on a diet, starvation plus. And at the time, tunnels were thriving because they allowed people to smuggle in KFC, quite literally. You would pay about $30 for a KFC meal, a bucket, to get it from the Sinai Desert delivered to you. Not necessarily warm, but it was prestigious at the time that you could manage to get KFC in Gaza. So you have this piece of land where you cannot have a McDonald's, you cannot have foreign investments, you cannot have anything going. And asking at the end of the day, why didn't they manage to build a thriving economy? Again, this is the point that David Satterfield sort of debunked himself, although he's a Biden appointee, very pro-Israeli, very sort of vehement Zionist. But nonetheless, he said, we told Israel, open up Gaza after they withdrew from inside the enclave. They refused and did the opposite, closed it down. There's the other funny fact, is that Hamas, a lot of the rockets they built were recycled from the remnants of unexploded ordnance that Israel bombs Gaza with regularly, with these mowing the grass operations every few years, even every few months. About 15% of them don't explode, so they can recycle that. That's plenty of material to build rockets. They don't need to look elsewhere. The other element, there's this video of Hamas digging up pipelines, water pipelines, where Israel points and says, that's the reason why Gaza doesn't have water. But in the video itself, it says these water pipelines were built by Israel in the previous settlements in Gaza to divert water from Gaza towards Israel itself, which basically had no use for Gaza's basic water infrastructure itself. I don't agree that they recycle it into rockets. I don't agree with that. But at the same time, they didn't sort of loot what was coming from the outside and turn it into rockets. I was at some point I was at a workshop where there was a guy that used to work heavy shot in NATO for some reason, an American military expert, and he basically said that we should not, after the war ends, we should not allow Gaza any metal water pipelines anymore. It should be only plastic. Israel has been doing that since 2006, even before. It's only plastic pipes that go in for water, nothing metal. But then he said something more. He said, yeah, we should not allow any concrete or steel into Gaza. That's a dominant thinking in Israel and even in Washington. He said we should only allow fiberglass and glass to go and build homes. It's literally who lives in a glass house should not cast stones. So how do you build an economy with those people explicitly saying you're not going to be able to build an economy? So that was the point about, like, it's the other thing is that you had in Gaza nearly 10,000 unemployed engineers. If engineers have no income, nothing to do, no projects, no infrastructure, it's incredibly easy for Hamas to recruit them to build tunnels. What else are they going to do? There's no possibility of building something. That does not mean I justify or condone Hamas's actions, but it's the situation. Hamas managed to maintain the apparatus of armed resistance under the very simple notion that we're not allowed to live, we're not allowed to survive, and this is the only way we can shake up the status quo. So that's basically the equation. Had Gaza been given a chance to live, had it been easier to import chocolates than smuggle RPGs, Gaza would have taken a dramatically different course.
The classic talking point, or one of the classic talking points, Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields.
Well, basically, there's a lot to unpack here as well. When you ask people from Washington, why do you keep repeating the human shields point? They would say it's a political term. No, they don't refer to the legal one, where you force people or direct civilians movements to protect and shield military assets or military personnel. Amnesty International, they said, I think around 2014, that Amnesty International quote found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. It found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups used forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters, nor that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which have been commandeered by militants. So Amnesty says we did not find any evidence of Hamas actually taking human shields that fit the legal definition. You have even the Magan Adom, the Israeli emergency ambulance service, that said in 2008, 2009, after the Operation Cast Lead, they said there were no evidence that Hamas was using ambulances as human shields. You have human rights organizations, journalists going into Gaza that said we did not see any evidence of Hamas doing what would fit the legal definition as human shield. Now, what Washington refers to, and Israel and NATO, is basically fighting from within urban spaces politically can be interpreted as human shielding because you are taking advantage of the urban space to operate. But that has another name. It's called guerrilla warfare. And it's been used all across the world. Basically, Gaza is the most densely populated area in the Middle East, one of the most densely populated in the whole world. Urbanization is everywhere. That there is no hiding places, there is no sort of empty places, there is no militant spots that allow militants to go and sort of separate from the population. It's an urban jungle. You don't have any parks basically in Gaza, any green surfaces or areas except for very few, very tiny limited spaces. So fighting from an urban space is inevitable. The alternative that is proposed to that is basically that Hamas should go out to an empty area, a desert, and line up like ducks and wait to be bombarded from above. That's the only thing that would sort of challenge the political interpretation of human shields. I don't say that mistakes are not occurring or certain actions are not happening. There are instances where you would see, for instance, that an armed group, although not identified, fired an improvised locally manufactured projectile from a few 100 meters or a few dozen meters near a school or an area of the sort. That Israel uses then to bomb the school itself or the entire area. But even in that case, even if you think that this case fits the definition of the political interpretation of human shielding, not the legal one, even then, Israel is obligated not to target a civilian target. If I take you as a human shield, would the cops shoot both of us? That is the ridiculous point here, is that Israel is obliged to shoot both of us.
The death count in Gaza can't be trusted. It's been inflated. That's another talking point.
Yeah, the death count by the United Nations itself, they say it's an underestimate. You don't have the full extent. Up until November, it was very meticulous because the health system was functioning. They were able to document every case, every name, the date, the ID number, the birth date, etc. They were incredibly meticulous about that until Israel went and destroyed every single one of these hospitals that functioned as documentation sites for the casualties. But even after that, they tried to maintain a rudimentary system of documentation as much as possible. But a lot of cases slipped their attention. So I looked up the list that was released in late March, early April by the health ministry, where they name about, I think, 21,000 people. A lot of people I know were never on the list. They were not even mentioned. A lot of people I know that were killed by Israel. A lot of people that I know that are missing under the rubble are not on the list. There are a lot of cases where there's unreported deaths in Gaza because the family or people are besieged in a school or in their home. Some of them get shot by snipers or killed by shelling or fragments from rockets, and they have to bury them there on site without the ability to go out and report or take the body to a hospital to document the death. So that's basically one thing. The other is that the health ministry over the last many years has been incredibly accurate, the Gaza health ministry, incredibly accurate with Human Rights Watch and Israel's own records, to the extent that even there with this war, Israel is using the Gaza health ministry in its internal reporting. The CIA, the State Department, the United States is using it, which is why now Congress is about to pass a bill that prevents any US government agency from citing the Gaza health ministry anymore. There is another talking point about the death and the health ministry, and that's basically to say that we don't know how many of them were killed by Hamas misfired rockets. Maybe 99% of them were killed that way. And the point about it, the pure insensitivity, the pure moral depravity and bankruptcy, can I make a similar argument and say we don't know how many people were killed on October 7th by Israel itself? There's now an IDF report that's about to come out this month in which they say that there were many, quote, many incidents of friendly fire. And then another report, they said a lot of incidents of friendly fire. And I think in another one, they said enormous incidents of friendly fire. Can I, for that reason, say that we don't know how many were killed by Israeli friendly fire? Therefore, I'm going to dismiss the entire death count out of hand. As long as you don't have evidence as to how many, you cannot reduce the death count. You can presume that all of them were killed on October 7th by militant groups, as long as you don't have evidence to the contrary. And it's the same in Gaza, as long as you don't have evidence to misfired rockets killing people. Israel has the most advanced high-tech surveillance in the region, if not in the world. They surveil Gaza day and night for the last 2 decades, now even more intensely. If there's any incident of misfired rocket killing people, they would have it on record. They would have a full footage of it. The other thing that they say is that we don't know how many militants versus civilians were killed. And at the same time, they come with a death count that is very incredibly laughable. They just throw a number in and test the grounds. If it sticks, they can go a bit far and test it. So they started by saying 2-to-1 was the ratio of civilians to combatants killed. So a third of those killed were Hamas. And they were very sort of persistent on that one. And they said this sets a golden standard in modern warfare of basically the lowest civilian death count possible in an urban space. If you look at Hamas's attack on October 7th, the death ratio of Israeli militants to civilians, it was 1.7 civilians to 1 militant. It was even better than Israel's in Gaza. Does that exonerate Hamas or October 7th? But they tried to throw that figure. The world played along with it. Now they throw another one, 1-to-1. It's just incredibly brazen. How can you go from 2-to-1 to 1-to-1 within a few weeks and stick to that? And both of them presume that every man killed in Gaza was a Hamas militant, every single man. Because the only indicator they use in that was basically to say that any woman or child is not necessarily Hamas, every man is Hamas. And they reduced the death count of children and women because the health ministry said that we have about over 10,000 not fully identified individuals. Not fully identified means that they don't have the birth date or the ID number. They have the name, but they don't have either of these: birth date, ID number, location of death, location of residence. That's how meticulous it is. Unless they have the full details, they would leave it with the people that are yet to be identified. Or in other instances where people are hacked into pieces or run over by Israeli tanks and turned into mush, or burned and incinerated, or fully decomposed on the street and feasted upon by dogs and cats in front of Israeli soldiers, then you cannot possibly fully identify the victim. But Israel says, based on the identified victims, they say it's a 1-to-1 ratio, that every man killed in Gaza was Hamas. It's absolutely insane.
2 final talking points. One of them is about journalists, and the Palestinian journalists have obviously suffered the biggest slaughter of journalists in a conflict in such a short space of time, if we can call this a conflict. That they're actually propagandists for Hamas, and in fact they're militants.
Yeah, that point was raised a lot of times by Israelis who would say that, even Israeli left-wing journalists who would say that you cannot count a Palestinian journalist in Gaza as a journalist because they're not free to speak up. That's basically the talking point, or that they are in bed with Hamas. It is incredibly insane. Even in Israel, you cannot, as a journalist, speak up in many ways, either because of the military censorship. There's a military censorship where they can ban explicitly certain topics from being discussed in the media at all, under a security pretext or the pretext of maintaining civil calm and whatever social cohesion. There's a military censor as part of the Amman intelligence agency in Israel, part of the military, where they can ban anything. And Netanyahu has been using it to even ban leaks from the cabinet. He tried to pressure them. So you don't have full freedom of speech for Israeli journalists either. There's also the heavy price of intimidation, physical and verbal threats against any Israeli that dares to speak up. There's even an Israeli hostage, if I remember her name precisely, I think it's Agam Almo-Goldstein. She basically has been receiving a lot of death threats because she said, I think, one thing positive about her time in captivity in Gaza after returning to Israel. She's been, in Haaretz, reported that she's been receiving a lot of hatred, a lot of backlash in Israel from the right for just basically not fully going on and saying everything there was hell on earth and it's total garbage and kill everyone there. It's the same for Israeli journalists. You see a lot of intimidation levied against them as well. So in comparison, there's not much of a difference between if you presume Hamas is intimidating people. But even then, in the war in Gaza, Hamas has, according to Israel, lost the ability to be visible on the ground. How do they intimidate people? How do they enforce censorship if they're not there? There was recently an article in Haaretz with a former senior CNN international correspondent that went into Gaza. She's the head of an international humanitarian agency at the moment. I don't remember her name, sorry. But she says that she didn't see a single Hamas militant her entire time in Gaza. So the censorship enforcement is out of the question. There's the other element of saying, okay, don't trust us. Say that all Gazans are Hamas. Why did you allow a single foreign journalist into Gaza or a fact-finding mission? That's basic obstruction of justice. You are not allowing any of them in. There's then the third point, that a lot of Gazan journalists nowadays, even including some of the people that were killed, were incredibly critical of Hamas on record. Someone like Mu'taz Azaiza, for instance, who became the face of Gaza during the war, criticized Hamas many times, advocated for peace and coexistence in many situations, while in Gaza itself. I've seen other journalists as well. A lot of journalists, especially women that you see nowadays, Bisan, Hind al-Khudari, others, without a hijab or without a head covering, very liberal, very secular. They come from sort of either liberal or left-wing backgrounds in Gaza, incredibly on record challenging Hamas many times. So it's ridiculous in that way as well. And so far, the only evidence Israel has provided of journalists' complicity with Hamas was trust us. They released, I think, one paper, a list in Arabic, in which Hamza al-Dahdouh, the son of the Al Jazeera journalist that they killed in Rafah, who was a journalist himself, they released one paper that said, look, his name is on that list, so he's Hamas, without any sort of verification of the source of that document.
This is the final talking point I want to run by you. And this keeps coming up over and over again. This will all just end if Hamas surrenders, releases the hostages and surrenders. This whole nightmare that Gaza is going through will therefore end, and therefore this is all Hamas's responsibility and no one else.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, or at least two very important dimensions. The first one is basically, would Hamas surrender? And if they did, would that end armed resistance as an idea to challenge an occupation, a belligerent occupation, or even a military dictatorship at this point, and an apartheid system? As Israeli generals themselves now concede, Daniel Hagari, Admiral, spokesperson of the IDF, he says Hamas cannot be destroyed as an idea. It'll always be there. A lot of Israeli generals say it cannot be even destroyed as a group or a militant group or as a movement. But even if you concede that Hamas leaders would go out and say, okay, we surrender, drop your arms, would their own members in Gaza on the ground facing death, would they surrender? Would they agree to disarm? If you look at the situation with any armed conflict at all, Colombia, Northern Ireland, etc., there is no possibility for disarmament as a prerequisite to a political process. It always comes as the outcome of a process. That's why I think Jonathan Powell, who was the chief of staff of Tony Blair, he wrote a book about talking to terrorists in which he addressed the exact same point. He said the demand on Hamas to disarm or surrender before there's an end to the occupation is ludicrous. It's a non-starter. Nobody would agree to it whatsoever. Even if Hamas leaders agree to it, their militants on the ground would not agree to it. How do you disarm every single individual that believes there's no other path to freedom or life, basic life, other than this, because every other path has been blocked and proven to be futile by Israel? There's the other dimension, is basically that at the moment actually strengthens Hamas in the eyes of Palestinians. It's basically, what would happen if Hamas surrenders and you disarm every single militant of Hamas? What would Israel do the day after? Is it going to be kumbaya and Gaza thrives and the occupation ends in the West Bank? And Israel, the only thing they keep saying to Gaza, if Hamas is gone, we're going to reoccupy Gaza militarily. That's the moderate version. That's the Yoav Gallant, Benny Gantz version. Gaza under permanent Israeli military occupation on the ground. Gaza divided into four pieces: the Netzarim corridor, 20% of Gaza's area in the east swollen by Israel's buffer zone, another corridor now being built between Khan Yunis and Rafah, and the corridor between Gaza and Egypt. It's going to be under immense blockade, and with Israeli military able to raid it at free will, to mow the grass, cut the blades of anyone that tries to challenge the occupation or slow death, or in that case, even immediate death. That's one thing. The Netanyahu version is sliding towards controlling Gaza completely, which is what Yoav Gallant has been warning about, that we're going to end in a situation where the IDF controls Gaza's government and military security affairs at the same time. We're in full control, a dictatorship. And Gallant, the only reason why he opposes it, it's because it's going to drain the IDF and exhaust its resources and personnel. They don't have enough personnel for that kind of task. Then there's the version of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and a lot of voices on the right which say turn Gaza into a parking lot, a huge settlement, an Israeli settlement, and kick everybody out. So the versions that you get from the Israeli political mainstream, from the center to the far right, is a nightmare for Gaza. Gaza is going to be unlivable under Israeli control, where they can go in and out and kill whoever they want. You don't get any terms of surrender like Japan, of saying, you surrender, we do this massive reconstruction and bring back the economy in top shape, or Western Germany in that sense. You don't have a promise of prosperity or progress, which now positions Hamas actually as the last thing, the last force that is able to prevent Israel from full takeover and permanent presence inside Gaza. So there's in Gaza, there's a before Rafah and after Rafah. If you look at the Wall Street Journal, that article with Sinwar and other sources close to Hamas, they would say that up until the point where Israel invaded Rafah, there were dissenting voices in Hamas's top leadership. They were not fully unified. As soon as Israel invades Rafah, Hamas becomes more confident and more unified, because number one, it proved that Hamas is indestructible, because now Israel has taken over everything without being able to defeat them. And it proved that Israel has failed to find the hostages or kill Hamas's top leaders. They've now taken over all of Gaza without finding any of the hostages in Rafah. They kept promising the hostages are in Al-Shifa, no, in Khan Yunis, now in Rafah. They couldn't find a single one in Rafah itself or a single Hamas leader there. And they managed to portray a picture where they are Palestinians' only remaining army or only remaining barrier towards an existential threat of demise and kicking out the population. So that's why you don't have surrender. That even if Hamas contemplates it, the terms of surrender that Israel impose make the benefit of continuing the fight by far greater, much greater than laying down arms. But nonetheless, Hamas said recently, twice, they said, we are willing to disarm, lay down our arms if Israel ends the occupation. And our Qassam brigades, all of those militants, can be integrated into a Palestinian army or security force. We're not going to exist as a military force anymore if the occupation ends. But you have an Israeli mainstream where they were asked the questions, would you agree to ending the occupation if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel and the Arab world as well, and Hamas is disarmed, and this and this and that happened? And I think the poll that I'm aware of, the majority said no at the time. It was not appealing for them.
Muhammad, we've so comprehensively gone through so many myths, and we can see, I think everyone can hear what an encyclopedic grip on the facts, the reality, the truths, which a lot of the time, well, most of the time, the media in Western countries erase. The context, what's actually happening on the ground, the realities, which is why we have a Western media ecosystem which essentially rigs the terms of, or the way this is framed on the terms most favorable to the Israeli state. And that's why it's so important that we have voices like Muhammad to correct the lies, the myths, the distortions, the gaslighting. I think gaslighting is something which the Israeli state excels in. So personally, just Muhammad, I'm kind of in awe as ever of your work. It's so important people share this video, get the message out. Maybe, you know, arm yourself with this knowledge. There are people out there who may be misled, to say the least, by what the Israeli state's cheerleaders put out. So it's important that we correct those myths. So do share this video, leave your comments, press like, subscribe, but leave your comments, engagement, very important to get the message out. But Muhammad, as ever, I'm always in awe of you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, thanks so much for being incredibly outspoken on the topic. I think the thing that's letting Gaza down the most is not pure evil, but rather cynicism, cupidity, self-interest, ignorance, and fear, careerism, fear of losing jobs or fear of not advancing enough in a job. And speaking up, putting your neck on the line at this time is incredibly powerful. So thank you.
Well, I'd never forgive myself, but I agree with you. It's the silence which is always, I think, throughout history, responsible for allowing these crimes to continue. It's the silently complicit who allow the great horrors of our age to continue. So it's important we all speak out, but we can only speak out because we have the likes of you to arm us with the facts. So thank you so much.
Thank you.